Did you know that one of the scariest objects in horror movie history, a tiny silver ball that flies through the air and drills into people's heads, was almost never put in the movie at all? That one strange little prop changed everything. It turned a low-budget film made by a group of friends into one of the most talked-about horror movies of all time. Phantasm, released in 1979, was made with almost no money, almost no experience, and almost no rules. And that is exactly what made it extraordinary. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about Phantasm. Number 20. A teenager helped write the whole thing. Most big Hollywood movies are written by teams of experienced screenwriters who have spent years learning their craft. Studios hire professionals. They hold meetings. They review drafts. They make changes. The process is slow, careful, and expensive. But Phantasm did not work that way at all. The person who came up with the story, wrote the script, and eventually directed the entire film was a young man named Don Coscarelli. And when he first started developing the ideas that would become Phantasm, he was barely out of his teenage years. He was in his early 20s, full of wild imagination, and completely unafraid of trying something that had never been done before. Don had already made a couple of small films before Phantasm. They were not horror movies. They were simple, quiet stories about growing up. But something changed inside him. He became fascinated with dreams, the strange, twisting, sometimes terrifying logic of nightmares. He wanted to make a movie that felt like a dream you cannot escape. So, he started writing. He wrote quickly and freely, without worrying too much about whether the ideas made perfect sense. He let his imagination run wild. He created a world where the rules of life and death were broken, where a mysterious tall man dressed in black controlled a mortuary, where the dead were turned into strange small creatures, where silver spheres flew through hallways and hunted people. What makes this even more remarkable is that Don did not have a finished, polished script before filming began. Many scenes were developed as they went along. He would think of something new on the day of shooting and simply try it. That kind of creative freedom is almost unheard of in professional filmmaking. But it gave Phantasm its unique, dreamlike, unpredictable energy. Audiences who watched it for the first time never knew what was coming next. And the reason for that was simple. Neither did Don Coscarelli. What looked like a carefully planned nightmare was actually a beautiful, terrifying accident of creativity. Number 19. The movie was shot over 2 full years. Making a movie usually takes weeks or months of continuous filming. Crews work long days back to back. Actors stay on location. Everything moves forward in one long push until the shoot is finished. But Phantasm did not follow that timeline. Because the filmmakers had very little money, they could not afford to film everything at once. They had to stop, wait, save more money, then start again. This process stretched the entire production across almost 2 full years, from 1977 to 1978. Think about what that means for the people involved. The actors had to remember their characters over a long period of time. Continuity, making sure hair, clothing, and locations all looked the same from scene to scene, became a real challenge. When you film one scene in the spring and the next connected scene in the winter, things look different. People age slightly. Lighting changes. The world around you shifts. Keeping everything consistent when your schedule is broken into pieces takes enormous discipline and attention to detail. But here is the amazing part. When you watch Phantasm today, you would never guess it was filmed that way. The movie feels remarkably consistent in its atmosphere and tone. The strange, eerie feeling never breaks. Don Coscarelli managed to hold his vision together across those long stretches of time, and his small crew stayed loyal and committed throughout. They believed in what they were making, even when the future of the project was uncertain. That kind of dedication is rare. Most low-budget productions fall apart under financial pressure. People walk away. Energy fades. But the team behind Phantasm kept going, kept coming back, and kept believing. What looked smooth and continuous on screen was actually stitched together across hundreds of days and countless small sacrifices. It looked effortless. It was anything but. Number 18. The Tall Man was found. By accident, every great horror movie needs a great villain. Freddy Krueger had his glove. Jason had his mask. And Phantasm had the Tall Man, a pale, cold, terrifying figure who became one of the most iconic characters in horror history. But the man who played him, Angus Scrimm, was not originally thought of as a horror actor at all. His casting came about in a way that felt almost as strange as the movie itself. Angus Scrimm was a friend of Don Coscarelli's family. He was a respected music journalist and had done some acting work, but he was not a well-known performer. He was tall, naturally commanding, and had a face that could shift between warmth and cold menace with unsettling ease. When Don was putting together his cast and trying to figure out who could play this mysterious, powerful villain, someone suggested Angus. Don met with him and immediately felt something click. What made Angus Scrimm perfect for the role was not just his height or his striking appearance. It was the quality of his presence. When he walked into a room, people noticed. When he spoke, his voice carried a deep, rich authority. He could make the simple act of standing still feel threatening. He understood the character intuitively and brought a dignity and intelligence to the Tall Man that elevated the entire film. The famous line, "Boy," delivered with that chilling, echoing voice, became instantly recognizable to horror fans around the world. Angus Scrimm became so associated with the role that he would play the Tall Man across multiple sequels spanning decades. He owned that character completely. And it all started because a friend knew a friend. What felt like a casual suggestion turned out to be one of the most important casting decisions in horror movie history. Number 17. The Silver Sphere was built in a garage. Of all the things that made Phantasm famous, nothing captured the imagination of audiences quite like the Silver Sphere. It is a small, polished metal ball that flies through the air with terrifying precision, latches onto a victim's head, and drills straight through with a blade that springs from its surface. It is one of the most creative and original horror weapons ever put on film. And it was built by hand in someone's garage with a very small budget and a lot of improvisation. The sphere was constructed using components that were not originally designed for filmmaking at all. Parts were sourced from different places and assembled with care and creativity. The team had to figure out how to make it look like it was flying on its own, how to make the drilling mechanism work convincingly, and how to film it all in a way that felt genuinely threatening rather than obviously fake. Different techniques were used for different shots. Sometimes the sphere was pulled along wires, sometimes it was thrown. Sometimes creative camera angles and editing made the movement look far more controlled than it actually was. The famous shot of the sphere flying down a hallway required careful planning and multiple takes. Nothing about it was simple. But audiences watching in theaters in 1979 did not see any of that difficulty. Old tools, ordinary materials, but one extraordinary idea. Number 16. Real locations made everything stranger. Many horror movies build elaborate sets inside studios to create their frightening environments. Sets can be controlled, lighting can be adjusted, every detail can be planned. But Phantasm used real locations, and that decision gave the movie a quality that no studio set could have replicated. The most important location was a real mortuary called Dunsmuir House, a stunning historical mansion in Oakland, California that became the Morningside funeral home in the film. Dunsmuir House was genuinely impressive and genuinely eerie. Its grand architecture, long dark hallways, and old-fashioned rooms created an atmosphere that felt both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Audiences watching the movie could sense that they were looking at a real place. There was a weight and authenticity to the location that gave every scene filmed there an extra layer of dread. Filming in a real building also meant working around real limitations. The crew could not knock down walls or change the layout. They had to adapt their plans to the actual space. Lighting a real building with its uneven floors, low ceilings in some areas, and grand open spaces in others required constant problem solving. But every challenge they overcame gave the finished film something precious, a sense of reality that made the horror feel closer and more possible. When the tall man walked down those real marble floors in those real wood-paneled rooms, the fear felt genuine because the space was genuine. A movie about death and the afterlife, filmed inside a building where people had come to mourn for real, carried an emotional truth that no constructed set could have matched. The place itself was part of the storytelling. What looked like a perfectly chosen movie set was actually just a building with its own history and its own quiet darkness. Number 14. The film confused everyone, including the studio, when Phantasm was completed and shown to potential distributors. Reactions were complicated to say the least. The movie did not fit neatly into any existing category. It was a horror film, yes, but it was also something else entirely. It had the emotional weight of a story about grief and loss. It had the dreamlike logic of a surrealist film. It had moments of genuine warmth between its characters. And it had sequences that made absolutely no straightforward logical sense, by design. Studio executives and distributors were often puzzled by what they were watching. Was it a horror movie? A fantasy? A coming-of-age story? A nightmare film? The answer was all of these things at once, and that made it difficult for traditional movie business people to know how to sell it. They were used to films that could be summarized in one sentence and compared to something they had seen before. Phantasm defied that. Don Coscarelli had intentionally created a movie that operated on dream logic rather than realistic logic. Things happened in Phantasm that were never fully explained. Connections between events were emotional rather than strictly rational. The film trusted its audience to feel their way through the story rather than understand it step by step. That was a bold, creative choice, but it made marketing the film a genuine puzzle. Eventually, AFCO Embassy Pictures agreed to distribute it, and Phantasm was released in 1979. And something remarkable happened. Audiences loved it. Critics were divided, but the people sitting in theaters responded with real passion. The movie that was too strange to categorize found its audience anyway, an audience that appreciated exactly its strangeness. What confused the industry became beloved by the fans. Number 13. The young actors were found locally the two young heroes of Phantasm, brothers Mike and Jody, played by A. Michael Baldwin and Bill Thornbury, were not experienced Hollywood actors when they were cast. They were young people from the local area who Don Coscarelli discovered through local casting and personal connections. Their relative inexperience was not a weakness. It turned out to be one of the film's greatest strengths. A. Michael Baldwin, who played Mike, the younger brother, was genuinely young when filming began. His emotions throughout the film, his fear, his determination, his grief over the loss of his parents, had an authentic quality that comes when performance has not yet become a professional habit. He was not performing fear by following a technical method. He was feeling something real and letting the camera catch it. Bill Thornbury as Jody brought a natural warmth and protectiveness to his role that made the bond between the brothers feel genuinely loving and real. The relationship between Mike and Jody is the emotional heart of Phantasm. Everything frightening in the movie is made more powerful because we care about these two people and their connection to each other. That caring was built on performances that felt truly human rather than polished and professional. Reggie Bannister, who played Reggie the Ice Cream Man and became another beloved character in the franchise, was also not a big Hollywood name. He was a musician and a friend of the production. His easy charm and genuine likability made Reggie a character audiences immediately trusted. Together, these locally found performers created a cast that felt like real people caught in an impossible situation. And that realism made the horror all the more effective. Not trained actors performing fear, just real people, really scared. Number 12. The music was written by the director himself. Film scores are usually created by professional composers who specialize in writing music for movies. Directors hire them, describe the emotional needs of each scene, and trust the musicians to deliver something that enhances the story. But Don Coscarelli took a different approach with Phantasm. He wrote much of the iconic music himself, working with a small team to create a score that perfectly matched the dream world atmosphere of his film. The Phantasm theme, a simple haunting melody built around repeating notes, is one of the most recognizable pieces of music in horror film history. When you hear those few notes, you immediately feel something shift inside you. Something uneasy begins to stir. The music prepares your body for fear before the images on screen have done anything frightening at all. That is the power of a truly effective horror score. What makes it even more impressive is that the music was created without a large budget or professional orchestral resources. It was built from simpler elements and made to work through sheer cleverness and instinct. The repeating, cyclical quality of the theme perfectly mirrors the repeating, cyclical logic of the nightmare story it accompanies. The music and the movie think in the same way. They move in the same emotional direction. Many film scholars and music critics have praised the Phantasm score for its psychological effectiveness. It does not overwhelm the senses with loud, dramatic sounds. Instead, it creeps in quietly and stays with you long after the scene is over. That kind of subtle musical storytelling is rare. And the fact that a first-time horror director created it with limited resources makes it even more extraordinary. What sounded professionally composed was made with passion, instinct, and very little money. Number 10. Angus Scrimm created the tall man's walk and actors' physical performance. The way they move their body, hold their posture, and occupy space can be just as powerful as the words they speak. And Angus Scrimm understood this deeply. The way the tall man moves in Phantasm is one of the most distinctive and frightening physical performances in horror cinema. That rigid, slightly inhuman walk, that cold, deliberate posture, that sense that this figure exists slightly outside the normal rhythms of human movement. Angus Scrimm created all of that himself. There was no movement coach telling him how to walk. There was no choreographer blocking his physical performance. Angus worked from his own understanding of the character and his own creative instincts. He decided that the tall man should move as if he were slightly above the ordinary concerns of physical existence, as if gravity itself was something he merely tolerated rather than obeyed. That quality, subtle but deeply unsettling, comes through clearly in every scene. Angus also made a decision about the tall man's emotional temperature. He played the character not with theatrical villainy or obvious menace, but with something colder and more frightening, an absolute indifference. The tall man does not hate the people he harms. He simply does not regard them as significant. That kind of cold, detached power is far more frightening than angry malice, because it offers no possibility of appeal or mercy. These were artistic choices made by a thoughtful, intelligent performer who took his role seriously regardless of the budget or the production circumstances. Angus Scrimm gave the tall man a life that went far beyond what was written on the page. He gave him a soul, or rather, the chilling absence of one. That was not the script. That was pure performance, pure craft, pure Angus. Number 9. The film was originally rated X when Phantasm was submitted to the Motion Picture Association of America for rating before its release. The response was not what Don Coscarelli had hoped for. The film received an X rating, the most restrictive category available at the time, usually reserved for adult content. An X rating meant that the film could not be shown in most mainstream theaters, which would have been devastating for its commercial prospects. The specific content that triggered the X rating was primarily a scene involving violence. The sequence where the silver sphere first attacks its victim, with blood and graphic detail that the ratings board considered too extreme for an R rating. Don Coscarelli faced a difficult choice. He could leave the scene as it was and accept the X rating with all its commercial limitations, or he could cut or modify the sequence to bring the film into R-rated territory. He chose to make cuts. He trimmed the sequence carefully, removing enough of the explicit content to satisfy the ratings board while preserving as much of the scene's impact as possible. The film was re-rated R and went on to be distributed and shown widely. But the original uncut version of that scene represented something important to Coscarelli, the full impact of what he had imagined. Over the years, discussion of the original cut has become a point of fascination among Phantasm fans and collectors. The question of what was lost in those edits and how different the film might have felt with the original sequence intact is something enthusiasts continue to debate. What reached audiences in theaters in 1979 was a slightly gentle version of Don Coscarelli's original vision. What he first created was something even more extreme. Number 8. The sequel took almost a decade to arrive, when Phantasm proved to be a genuine commercial and cult success after its release in 1979. The natural expectation was that a sequel would follow quickly. Horror franchises typically move fast. If the first film makes money, the second film begins development almost immediately. Studios do not like to leave successful properties sitting idle when there is audience demand. But Phantasm 2 did not arrive until 1988, nearly a full decade after the original. That gap is extraordinary by any Hollywood standard. The reasons were complicated: rights issues, financing difficulties, and the challenge of assembling the right team under the right conditions all contributed to the long delay. Don Coscarelli himself had specific ideas about how a sequel should work, and he was not willing to compromise those ideas simply for the sake of moving quickly. During those 9 years between films, something interesting happened. The original Phantasm found new audiences through home video, cable television, and the growing cult movie circuit. People who had missed it in theaters discovered it and fell in love with it. People who had seen it in theaters watched it again and again on video. The film's reputation grew and deepened during those years rather than fading. By the time Phantasm 2 arrived, there was a passionate and devoted audience waiting for it. The long wait had actually increased the desire for more. Don Coscarelli used that time to make sure the sequel was worthy of the original rather than simply a quick commercial follow-up. His patience and his standards produced a sequel that satisfied the fans who had been waiting. Some things cannot be rushed. Some things need time to become what they are meant to be. Number 7. The film was made for less than $300,000. To truly appreciate the achievement of Phantasm, you need to understand the financial reality behind its production. The film was made for a budget of approximately $300,000. In the context of Hollywood filmmaking, even in the 1970s, this was an almost impossibly small amount of money. Major studio productions of the same era had budgets 10 times larger or more. Even other independent films often worked with significantly more resources. With $300,000, you cannot afford professional studio facilities. You cannot afford large crews of specialists. You cannot afford extensive special effects teams or elaborate post-production processes. Every dollar has to work as hard as possible. Every creative decision has to account for financial reality, and mistakes are devastating because there is no safety net of extra money to fix them. Don Coscarelli and his team made this tiny budget work through sheer ingenuity. They used real locations instead of expensive sets. They kept their crew small and gave people multiple responsibilities. They built their own props, including the famous silver spheres, rather than hiring outside fabricators. They improvised solutions to technical problems rather than paying specialists to solve them. Every challenge became an opportunity to be creative. The result was a film that earned many times its budget at the box office. Phantasm was a significant commercial success for its distributor, generating returns that made everyone involved look very smart indeed. The story of what $300,000 produced became one of the great examples in film history of how creativity and passion can outperform money. What cost almost nothing made something lasting, not just a movie, a legend. Number 6. Don Coscarelli directed his first film at 19. To understand where Phantasm came from, You need to understand who Don Coscarelli was before he made it. He did not arrive at Phantasm as an experienced filmmaker with years of industry knowledge behind him. He arrived as a young man who had taught himself filmmaking by simply doing it. His first feature film was made when he was just 19 years old, an almost unimaginable achievement. That first film, called Jim, the World's Greatest, was a quiet coming-of-age story with nothing in common with the horror world of Phantasm. It was made in 1976 and actually received a limited theatrical release, which was remarkable for a first film made by a teenager. His second film, Kenny and Company, from the same year, was another gentle story about young people. These early works showed a filmmaker learning his craft, developing his visual instincts, and growing his confidence. By the time Don turned to Phantasm, he had already made 2 feature films. He had real practical experience with cameras, editing, working with actors, and solving the 1,000 small problems that arise during film production. That experience, combined with his youth and his total creative freedom, made him uniquely positioned to make something bold and original. Most filmmakers who make something as distinctive as Phantasm do so after many years of working within the industry. Don Coscarelli did it before he was 25. He had not yet learned to be afraid of breaking rules because he had not yet spent enough time learning what all the rules were. His inexperience in the ways of the industry was itself a kind of superpower, and he used it to create something that no amount of industry experience would have produced. Number 5. The film has never been fully explained. On purpose, one of the most debated aspects of Phantasm among fans and film scholars is the question of what the movie actually means. What is the tall man? Where do the small hooded creatures come from? What is the dimension that opens through the tuning fork portal? Is any of what Mike experiences real, or is it all a dream? A manifestation of his grief over the loss of his parents and his fear of losing his brother? Don Coscarelli has been asked these questions hundreds of times over the decades since the film's release, and he has consistently refused to provide definitive answers. This is not because he does not have thoughts on the matter. It is because he believes deeply and sincerely that the ambiguity is the point. The mystery is the message. A horror film that fully explained itself would lose the very quality that makes it frightening and haunting. Dreams do not explain themselves. Grief does not make sense. The terror of death and loss cannot be logically resolved or neatly wrapped up. Phantasm mirrors all of this in its structure and storytelling. Things happen that do not connect in strictly logical ways. The ending leaves crucial questions unanswered. The viewer is left in a state of beautiful, productive uncertainty. This was a bold artistic choice that required confidence and conviction to maintain. The commercial instinct would have been to provide clear explanations, a definitive resolution, a tidy narrative bow. Don Coscarelli resisted that instinct completely. He trusted his audience to live with the mystery rather than demanding answers, and that trust has been rewarded across decades of passionate fan discussion and academic analysis. The movie that refuses to explain itself has never stopped being talked about. Number 3. The film inspired generations of filmmakers. Phantasm was released into a world that had already seen Halloween and was about to see Friday the 13th. The American horror film was undergoing a remarkable creative explosion in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and Phantasm was a significant part of that explosion. But its influence extended far beyond the horror genre and far beyond that particular moment in time. Filmmakers who grew up watching Phantasm have cited it as a crucial inspiration throughout their careers. The film's demonstration that a tiny budget, a passionate team, and an original vision could create something genuinely powerful and commercially successful sent an important message to an entire generation of aspiring directors. You did not need Hollywood. You did not need a studio. You needed an idea, a camera, and the courage to see it through. Directors as different from each other as J.J. Abrams, Guillermo del Toro, and James Wan have spoken about the importance of independent horror films of this era, films like Phantasm, in shaping their understanding of what cinema could be. The idea that genre films could be personal, could be meaningful, could carry emotional and even philosophical weight alongside their entertainment value. This was something that Phantasm demonstrated with particular clarity and conviction. The film also influenced the technical and creative development of low-budget filmmaking itself, its solutions to production problems, how to suggest things rather than show them directly, how to use location and atmosphere to replace expensive set construction, how to get maximum impact from minimum resources, became part of the shared knowledge of independent filmmakers everywhere. What one young director figured out in a California garage became a lesson that spread through decades of cinema. Number 2, the ending was changed to make room for a sequel. Don Coscarelli's original vision for the ending of Phantasm was definitive and devastating. In his initial conception, the story reached a conclusion that left no room for continuation. The horror was resolved, or rather, was shown to be irresolvable, and the characters reached the end of their journey in a way that felt final. It was a brave, bleak, uncompromising ending that matched the emotional truth of everything that had come before it. But as the film moved toward completion and there began to be interest from distributors and growing excitement about its commercial potential, conversations began about the possibility of a sequel. A definitively closed story cannot continue. If there was going to be a Phantasm 2, the ending of Phantasm 1 had to leave a door open. And so Don Coscarelli made a change. The ending that audiences saw in theaters in 1979 was revised to suggest the possibility of continuation. The final moments deliver a shock, a suggestion that the threat is not truly over, that the horror continues, that Mike's ordeal is not finished. This kind of ending, common in horror films since Carrie had used it so effectively in 1976, sets up the sequel while also delivering one final scare to the audience. Many fans have debated which ending is more powerful, the original closed version or the revised cliffhanger. The question can never be fully answered because most viewers have only experienced the released version. But the original ending exists as a reminder that even the films we know well might have been different. One changed scene, one open door instead of a closed one, and Phantasm became a franchise instead of a single, complete story. One small decision changed everything that followed. Number 1. Phantasm created a devoted cult that has lasted 50 years. Of all the remarkable facts about Phantasm, the most remarkable might be this one. The film that Don Coscarelli made with $300,000, a small group of loyal collaborators, a handmade silver sphere, and a camera he operated himself, has now been loved and discussed and celebrated for nearly 50 years. Generations of horror fans have discovered it, been frightened by it, been moved by it, and passed it on to others. It has never gone away. Cult films are not rare. Many movies find devoted niche audiences after failing commercially. But Phantasm is something rarer, a film that was both a commercial success in its time and a genuine cult phenomenon that grew and deepened across decades. Each new generation of horror fans discovers it and responds to it with the same passion as the audiences who saw it in theaters in 1979. Something in it remains alive and vital and true. 4 sequels followed over the decades, and the core cast, Michael Baldwin, Reggie Bannister, and Angus Scrimm, returned for all of them, maintaining a remarkable loyalty to the world they had created together. The final film in the series, Phantasm Ravager, was released in 2016, 37 years after the original. Angus Scrimm passed away shortly before its release, but his presence was in every frame of every film he made as the Tall Man, and his legacy is secure. The fans of Phantasm, who call themselves fans, are among the most devoted communities in all of film fandom. They organize screenings, create art inspired by the film, run websites and podcasts dedicated to its analysis, and gather to celebrate it with a warmth and enthusiasm that says everything about what the film means to them, not just entertainment, not just horror. Something deeper, something personal. Phantasm touched something true in people, and that truth does not fade with time. It was made by friends. It became family. Bonus fact, the Lost Dimension scene that changed everything there is a sequence in Phantasm that most casual viewers have probably not thought about too deeply. A brief moment where a doorway or portal of some kind opens and reveals another dimension or realm. It is strange and disorienting and fits perfectly into the dream logic of the film. But what few people know is that this sequence was originally conceived as something far more extensive. There was an entire subplot involving the other dimension that was written, partially planned, and ultimately not filmed or not included in the final cut. Don Coscarelli has spoken in various interviews over the years about how the mythology of the Tall Man's world was developed far beyond what appears in the finished film. There were ideas about where the small hooded creatures came from, compressed versions of dead bodies, transformed for slave labor in another realm. There were ideas about the nature of the Tall Man himself, whether he was originally human, what he had become, and why he was collecting the dead in the way that he did. Some of these ideas eventually surfaced in the sequels. Phantasm 2 and 3 and the films that followed expanded the mythology piece by piece, answering some questions while introducing new ones. But the original film was deliberately stripped of excessive explanation. Content that might have clarified the story was left out in order to preserve the mystery that Don considered essential to the film's power. There is said to exist early draft material and notes from the production period that sketch out a much more detailed version of the Tall Man's world and origins. Whether any of this material will ever be published or released to the public is unknown. But the existence of this deeper layer of thought and imagination beneath the film's surface explains why the mythology has always felt so rich and detailed, even when so little of it is explicitly shown. Don Coscarelli built more world than he showed. He knew things about his story that he kept to himself, sharing just enough to fire the audience's imagination without satisfying it completely. That is the mark of a master storyteller, knowing not just what to show, but what to withhold. What appeared on screen was only the visible part. Beneath the surface, a whole other world was waiting, and some doors are better left almost open. Phantasm is a film made from almost nothing that became something enormous. A young man's nightmare vision, built with handmade props and borrowed locations, and the loyal dedication of people who believed in something before they had any proof it would work. What Don Coscarelli created in the late 1970s was not just a horror movie. It was a love letter to imagination, a proof of what human creativity can accomplish when it refuses to be stopped by limitations. The film speaks about things that every human being understands in their deepest self: the fear of loss, the love between siblings, the terror of the unknown, the courage required to face what cannot be defeated. It wraps these truths inside images of silver spheres and tall, dark men and dimensional doorways, and the strange thing is that the wrapping makes the truth more powerful, not less. Sometimes the only way to say the hardest things is through a dream. Phantasm has outlived the moment that made it. It belongs not just to 1979, but to every year since then and every year to come. As long as there are people who love movies, who love horror, who love the idea that a small group of passionate artists can change the world with a camera and a vision, Phantasm will have an audience, and that audience will keep passing it on. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we will keep uncovering them, one story at a time.